Imagine the stone, not the smooth castle stone, but the cold, wet, unforgiving rock of the vault that will swallow your light. For the medieval woman, prison was never truly about rehabilitation. It was simply about waiting to be completely erased. Why did medieval justice treat women so brutally? And what happens when the walls see only the weak? You are not a warrior or a hardened criminal. You are simply a woman who stole bread, and the jailer knows it. Listen closely to the echoes of that darkness, a scream that is not pure fear but agonizing exhaustion, bouncing off walls thick with mildew and neglect. Though they say justice was blind in the Middle Ages, the unforgiving walls saw everything, especially the abandoned and the female, submissive at the threshold of the darkness, and the air immediately assaults you, thick, wet, and smelling of human waste and stagnant time. But why were these medieval prisons places of erasure? This is not the clean, clinical prison of modern imagination. It is a holding ground, a somber waiting room for the condemned. The torchlight flickers, casting deceptive shadows that make the rats appear larger than they are, weaving their roots through the stone dust and straw. Try to picture this space not as a hard-bitten soldier, but as a woman, perhaps guilty of nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or burdened by overwhelming poverty. The immediate stakes are high. Survival here is not guaranteed by strength, but by pure endurance against an environment designed to break the spirit, the ultimate test of survival in the medieval dungeon. Medieval prisons were fundamentally different institutions than modern ones. They were not places of long-term reform or structured sentencing. Their primary function was administrative, to secure individuals awaiting trial, judgment, or the collection of ransom. For women, these holding stations amplified the horror, and this is the little-known history of medieval female confinement. Women were viewed not merely as lawbreakers, but as moral degenerates who had violated the rigid social order. This dual condemnation meant they were entitled to neither the meager respect nor the basic physical protection afforded to male detainees. We must now step further into this dread reality, tracing the path of the women locked within the iron ramparts of medieval justice, and uncover why they were treated as moral degenerates. Crucially, the architecture of medieval incarceration was rarely, if ever, designed to accommodate female prisoners, an architectural bias that led to widespread suffering. The sprawling network of castle dungeons, ecclesiastical lockups, and city jails were predominantly built and operated by men for men. This systemic neglect ensured that separate facilities for women were either non-existent or utterly inadequate. When a woman was committed, she was often simply thrust into the communal space, regardless of the nature of her alleged crime or her physical vulnerability. This forced cohabitation created a volatile and terrifying environment, a structural injustice built into the very walls. But this wasn't the end of the cruelty, and the inevitable consequence of this forced cohabitation was widespread violation of dignity and severe suffering. Physical and emotional abuse was a constant threat, almost guaranteed by the prison's internal logic. What secrets did the medieval jailers hide? Historians examining records from 14th century London reveal that jailers frequently leveraged their control over essentials, food, water, access to sanitation, to extort forbidden indulgence from female prisoners. The very individuals charged with maintaining custody often became the gravest threat, overshadowing the crimes the women had supposedly committed, a truly terrifying reality of medieval confinement. The popular historical image often conjures up figures of great infamy, witches, heretics, or traitors, but the reality of who was imprisoned was far more mundane and therefore far more tragic. Who were the forgotten women of the medieval dungeons? The vast majority of female inmates were the forgotten of society, impoverished peasants, vulnerable widows, or homeless vagrants. Their crimes were often acts of desperation, the theft of a single loaf of bread, a scrap of cloth, or firewood necessary for warmth. Others faced charges related to debt, forbidden religious practices, or simply navigating the dangerous world without male protection. The hidden truth behind medieval incarceration. Medieval law rigidly positioned women as subordinate, perpetually guarded by a man, be it a husband, father, or feudal lord, leading to the question, Why was poverty a crime for women? When a woman deviated even subtly from the narrowly prescribed roles of wife, daughter, or servant, her actions were immediately flagged as potentially deviant or criminal. Legal historians note that any display of assertiveness or perceived social mobility, particularly in urban environments, could be interpreted as a threat to the established patriarchal order. The unprotected woman, lacking a viable male defender, became an easy target for arrest and confinement, a chilling consequence of patriarchal justice. Adding to the physical and social dangers was the economic reality of the prison system itself, where nothing was free. Why was medieval prison a deadly financial trap? Many medieval prisons operated as semi-private enterprises. Jailers rarely received a standard salary. Instead, they were entitled to charge fees for every necessity of a prisoner's confinement. Nothing was provided freely. Not the straw bedding, not the meager food, not the drinking water, and certainly not the removal of chains. This system functioned as a financial trap,
particularly lethal for women, who often lacked the means, contacts, or social influence to pay the exorbitant fees or bribes necessary for basic survival, making poverty a death sentence in the darkness. Consider the case of Alice of Bath, imprisoned in London's Newgate in 1293, a terrifying look at life in the Newgate dungeon. Her transgression was simple theft, driven by hunger. With no influential family to intercede, she was deliberately confined in a restrictive posture, chained in such a way that she could only sleep sitting upright. She could not feed herself for days. Her suffering was not exceptional. It was the baseline experience for the indigent female prisoner. The system sought not only to punish the crime, but to erase the dignity of the person. This is how medieval justice erased women's dignity. What came next changed everything for even high-born women, as even women of high social standing were not immune to this deliberate cruelty. Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, faced suspicion of forbidden practices in 1441. Despite her noble birth, she was initially interned under extremely harsh conditions within the Tower of London. Her imprisonment was less about securing justice and more about public humiliation and political destruction. She was later transferred to remote, isolated confinement at Peel Castle. Her high reputation shattered beyond recovery, proving that even nobility could not escape medieval punishment. While severe physical harm was sometimes less frequent in England than on the continent, female prisoners were nonetheless subjected to deeply demeaning penalties and prolonged psychological torment. A profound look at the psychological torment of medieval women. Justice was often a performance, aimed at reinforcing moral control. One mechanism of punitive shame focused specifically on women deemed disruptive to social harmony, and the most common offense leading to this punishment was scolding, or excessive gossiping, showing how moral control became a weapon. The infamous scold's bridle, or branks, was a terrifying instrument of submission, a medieval weapon of silence. This grotesque iron muzzle was clamped over a woman's head, fitting a metal bit painfully between the tongue and palate. The explicit intention was silencing and public shaming, forcing the offender into humiliating compliance. Though not exclusively a prison punishment, it represented the broader punitive context of the female experience under medieval law, demonstrating the medieval obsession with silencing women. In other instances, women accused of perceived moral degeneracy or forbidden beliefs were stripped and exposed to the public gaze, often paraded through the streets on a leash, a calculated act to humiliate them into total submission. The worst punishments for medieval women involved legalized public humiliation. In the context of investigating forbidden spiritual dealings, suspected women were subjected to invasive inspections for physical anomalies, moles, scars, or blemishes, alleged signs of a compact with the devil. These court-sanctioned tests amounted to legalized infringement upon personal boundaries, revealing the medieval state's obsession with female bodies. The least pleasant accounts concern pregnant inmates, raising the heartbreaking question of what happened to pregnant women in medieval dungeons. Because arrest was often sudden and indiscriminate, many women entered confinement already carrying a child, or they conceived while imprisoned. Giving birth in a medieval dungeon was an experience defined by near-zero sanitation, non-existent medical care, and the rapid spread of debilitating disease. The vulnerability of motherhood only intensified the physical deprivation, making the medieval dungeon a literal death sentence for mothers. A stark document from Norwich in 1325 details the plight of a woman identified only as Ma, a tragic case study of medieval neglect. Imprisoned for stealing, she carried her unborn child into the chill stone cell. Alone, she delivered her baby. Both mother and infant passed away within days, a death rooted in starvation, abandonment, and systemic cruelty. Her crime had been the desperate attempt to secure sustenance for her existing children, a tragic testament to the prioritization of property over human life above all else. The horrors did not spare the innocent, as many mothers were confined alongside their toddlers and infants. What was it like growing up in a medieval prison? These children existed in unimaginable conditions, constantly exposed to diseases, lice, and the presence of adult sickness. This was not a sequence of isolated, cruel incidents. It was a continuing pattern of systematic inhumanity woven into the very fabric of the penal system, ensuring that the suffering continued across generations. The scale of the suffering intensified significantly for women accused of political or religious crimes, such as treason or heresy. This is the truth of political punishment for medieval women. Anne Askew, a Protestant reformer, was confined and subjected to severe suffering in the Tower of London in 1546. While slightly outside the traditional definition of the medieval period, her story highlights the extreme violence of the state when confronting female dissent, a clear example of violence against female dissenters. Anne Askew was placed upon the rack, an instrument typically reserved for male use, due to the perceived severity of her spiritual defiance. How the state used the rack against women is a shocking detail. By the time of her tragic end at Smithfield, she was so physically broken she had to be carried to the pyre. Her case illustrates how female inmates were perceived not just as lawbreakers, but as fundamental threats to the moral, religious, and gendered control of the patriarchy, highlighting the ultimate threat of defying the patriarchy. Within this relentlessly dismal world, not all women were rendered helpless victims, showing us how medieval women fought back in silence. The darkest corners of the prison records also hold evidence of quiet, tenacious survival. This survival was achieved not through overt combat, but through sheer defiant endurance against the overwhelming force of the state, demonstrating a profound, hidden resilience. Sometimes, faint petitions, written or dictated by the female prisoners themselves, surface in the archives. These are the forgotten voices from the medieval vaults. These documents pleaded not for freedom, but often for simple mercy or justice in their treatment. These snippets of speech are profoundly moving, revealing a refusal to surrender the last vestiges of personhood, insisting on a glimmer of humanity even in the darkness. In 1383, a woman named Clarissa, imprisoned in Bruges, penned such a petition, a heartbreaking request for basic necessities. She did not dare request release from the city magistrates. Instead, she asked, reportedly with tears, for nothing more than bread and a fresh bed of straw to lie upon. This small, heartbreaking request speaks volumes about the level of deprivation and the insistence on retaining a fundamental human need, even when facing absolute deprivation. These women, stripped of all worldly possession, dignity, and autonomy, still insisted on being seen as human beings. Their petitions, protests, and silent endurance were acts of profound defiance in a world that sought to neutralize them entirely. The historical record confirms that even in total darkness, a sliver of the human spirit clung to life, demonstrating an ultimate refusal to be erased by the system. As the Middle Ages began its long transition into the Renaissance, faint seeds of reform began to appear, leading us to wonder, did prison reform ever reach medieval women? Certain urban institutions started to recognize the need to segregate male and female prisoners, acknowledging the systemic dangers of cohabitation. Voluntary and religious organizations also stepped forward, aiming to provide rudimentary care, food, and moral instruction to the neglected female population, marking the beginning of limited institutional change. Though these attempts marked the genesis of a primitive notion of prison as a rehabilitative space, the changes were sporadic, small, and inconsistent. The core structural issues that defined the medieval jail, overcrowding, sexual exploitation, and lethal neglect, persisted well into the early modern era. The deep cultural bias against the female offender remained firmly embedded in the penal logic, confirming that progress was frustratingly slow and inadequate. The medieval prison functioned as a brutal, amplified mirror of the external world, a place relentlessly hierarchical, strictly patriarchal, and profoundly ruthless, especially when it came to women. It systematically deprived them of personal autonomy, security, and dignity, subjecting them to routine humiliation and suffering. The jails speak powerfully of the historical attitudes towards gender, morality, and authority, revealing the prison as a reflection of patriarchal power. It is imperative that we do not remember these women solely as silent victims, because their stories include acts of profound bravery. They were the ones who endured, the ones who dared to write, who prayed, or who simply hung on to life with a fierce, quiet disobedience. Their resistance, however subtle, preserved their existence in the historical ledger, ensuring their survival in the historical record. The next time you gaze upon the ruined stonework of a forgotten castle, or peer into the cold recess of an old dungeon exhibit, pause. Ask yourself, who were the women forgotten behind those thick walls? What sounds of suffering did the darkness absorb?
Their isolation demands our historical recognition, forcing us to recognize the women forgotten by history. These echoes from the past remind us that justice, for a long time, was not applied equally. It was a tool of patriarchal control that punished not just acts, but existence itself. The medieval prison was a space designed to ensure that the unscripted woman, the poor, the desperate, the unsupported, was quietly removed from view and systematically diminished, proving that the system was designed for patriarchal control. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. If this history of the forgotten women of the medieval dungeons unsettled you, you're not alone. Walk further into history's shadows with us, and subscribe now to help us ensure these quiet stories of forgotten endurance are never, ever forgotten.